Hi, thank you, Katya. Yeah, everybody, thanks for joining today. We're hearing that there's you may be getting busier than you've been during COVID, and while that's a good thing, we also know it's challenging. So again, don't forget about the recorded sessions of everything we're doing. Today, we're going to talk about the COVID impact on ICU equipment and the testing of that equipment and ways that you can increase your testing efficiency, which now, especially as we see the workload coming back and increasing again, testing efficiency is going to be an important thing for each of you that are actually doing the testing. So let's jump into what was that impact. So just to review, and I'm sure you all have experienced this, as we started getting diagnosis of the virus, the COVID-19 virus, we saw a definite requirement to admit more and more and more people into the hospital. And many of those people needed to go to intensive care because their breathing was definitely challenged and impacted, and they needed help with that breathing, among other things. We didn't know a lot about this virus, if you'll remember. It was brand new. We didn't really know how to treat it, and we didn't really have effective medications. So it required a high intensity of clinical interaction to begin to learn about what was going on with this virus. And that increased the uncertainty and limited the access to the medical equipment in the ICU. We have an ever-changing environment, and the sanitation rules were changing around a little bit as we figured out how best to keep to we'll say flatten the curve by good sanitation practices. It was very different from a more normal medical equipment service day for all of you. Some of you were splitting shifts in order to be able to get access to the medical devices, um, perhaps in intensive care, but also in other areas. Also, in order to make sure we didn't have a crowd of people in the biomed shop, because we're trying to distance from each other, but still get the work done. And what a big challenge this was for everybody. And having been a biomed just like you, I really feel for you. My heart went out to all of you in terms of the challenges that you were facing. While this slide doesn't really show you all of the a variety of medical devices that a patient may need to have been connected to, and while not every patient needed a ventilator or even a CPAP or BiPAP system to help their breathing, everybody who went into ICU for sure was monitored with a patient monitor, and others were monitored with at least a pulse oximeter and probably an IBP and temperature in order to keep track of things. In the ICU, infusion pumps were often needed to be used. So these are the typical things, but they aren't an exhaustive list. So these were the things that not only the patient needed, but they were the things that we as biomeds needed to make sure we're working properly and were properly cleaned and tested between patients, along with our friends in SPD. So everything that we've mentioned, whether it's battery powered or powered by a power cord that plugs into the wall, whether it's a soap on the rope or a straight power cord with a power supply inside the medical device, all of them were electrically powered and therefore needed electrical safety testing done on them. And Mike, were you going to chime in on this one or the next one?
The next one, Jerry.
Okay, so here we go.
So I wanted to jump in and dive a little bit deeper into those three types of medical devices that somebody would find in the ICU. And the first is our patient monitors. Patient monitors are among the most common medical devices in the hospital, and they ensure that patients are correctly diagnosed and or are reacting properly to their treatment. A clinician that sees an incorrect vital sign that can really result in a misdiagnosis of a patient and that patient potentially receiving the wrong treatment, or receiving a treatment that he or she didn't need. So the other thing that's really important to note with patient monitors is that alarms sound, right? When certain thresholds are passed, an alarm is going to sound, and if it doesn't sound properly, a clinician could miss an opportunity to intervene with a patient. So it's not just what it measures; it's also that the alarms sound. This is a huge liability for the hospital, or can be. So ensuring that your patient monitors are measuring those patient vital signs properly is key. And going into a bit more detail, there are a few different parameters that patient monitors may or may not measure, depending on where they're being used. So a basic vital signs monitor would measure temperature, non-invasive blood pressure, NIBP, electrocardiogram, ECG, and blood oxygen saturation, SpO2. That gives a good picture of your normal patient with a less deteriorated condition. We're talking about the ICU today, so that's where the patient needs more monitoring, and the number of parameters are going to increase, as will the measurement technology. The measurement technology will actually become more invasive. So if you think about non-invasive blood pressure, they measure it via a cuff on the outside of the arm. And then when you move into the ICU, they may be measuring blood pressure with invasive blood pressure, and that's a transducer in the artery. Also, a parameter called cardiac output might be necessary to measure the blood flowing through the heart, right? This might become important to patients with critical conditions, and this is also measured invasively. So there are a lot of other parameters that help measure maybe the metabolism of oxygen through the body. End-tidal CO2 or EtCO2 might be added in some modules, but you can see that, depending on where it's being used, it might have a lot or a few parameters here. And in the ICU, you're definitely going to see more parameters and more invasive parameters as those conditions deteriorate.
Definitely so, Mike. In fact, the findings on the virus showed that the virus actually attacks the lung units in the lung. So it's not only that the patient's having a hard time breathing, but why? And that's because of uh, buildup of fluids and so forth, and restriction of airways, and the lung units are not functioning. The whole goal of this monitoring, especially during COVID, was making sure that we had a good gas exchange between what was being, the gases breathed in into the lungs, and the blood being properly oxygenated, and the carbon dioxide properly coming out of those lung units. So it was really, really important and very critical, and why we had such an increase in the need for intensive care beds.
And it's also important to note that medical devices fail, right? So we're talking about how they're being used and why they're important, but it can go wrong even in this day and age. It is becoming increasingly more infrequent, but there's no replacement for good routine preventive maintenance. And as you can see on this slide, the FDA, which is going to be US only data, so think about this number being larger globally, states that there are still 400 plus adverse events a year that relate only to two of the parameters I talked about, just NIBP and SpO2. So it's still something that we need to check. And again, these patient monitors are critical to a correct diagnosis and a correct treatment for these COVID patients.
Hey, Mike, I'd like to tag in there, man. Something we might not have mentioned before, though, is we were talking about specifically in the ICU, but a lot of these monitoring systems will go out to a central monitoring station, be it either housed at your hospital, at another hospital, at a third-party location. So are those parameters set up right? It might not be that the monitor isn't doing its job, but did we set up the parameters to trip at the right levels and the right alarms and the right conditions to alert us when these situations have happened? So one of some of the things I got to work on with our customers is using some of the devices to make sure that we can, to simulate some of these alarm states to trigger that central monitoring station and then make sure the appropriate responses have been happening.
No, that's a good point. So the other medical device that was really in the forefront in the past year was the ventilator, right? Um, and oop, and ventilators are they're really critical care devices that need to perform correctly every time because a patient's life could literally depend on it. There are some patients that need some assistance, right, to get the right amount of breath at the right amount of time and at the right rate. But there are also ventilators that might take over a patient's breathing completely, so their life depends on it. So really what a ventilator does is it controls flow, pressure, and volume, right, of air and breath to a patient, as well as the concentration of oxygen, right? And the thing that you need to get right here is that a patient can't get too much or too little of either of them, because either extreme can result in patient harm or even patient death. So one thing to note is here, again, with FDA data, ventilator malfunction comprises 58% of total reported adverse effects. The lungs are very sensitive organs, right? So these events might include volutrauma, right? Too much volume in the lungs, barotrauma, too much pressure in the lungs, asphyxiation, right? Oxygen deprivation to the patient. Each one of these can lead to lung damage, right? Could lead to scarring or even an embolism. So these are all good reasons to make sure that your ventilator is ready to use and safe to use for the next patient.
Back to you, Katya.
Oh, yeah. So we wanted to quickly do a little poll here where we were actually really curious, back to the topic that Michael was discussing about the ventilators and their use in the ICU. We're curious to know what was used in your facility to help COVID patient breathing. And the options that we have here are A, ventilators, B, CPAP, BiPAP, or C, anesthesia machines. So if you could go to our poll, and Dan, I think we could launch it now. You can pick the answer that's applicable to your facility. We will give it a few moments to capture your answers, and then we will announce the results.
Curious to see what pops up.
Mhm.
So I think Dan is the organizer of today's event. I think you could share the results with us. Please let us know what the audience has answered. Very nice.
Okay,
So we do see that, yeah.
Go ahead, Katya.
Yeah, go ahead. No, I just wanted to announce the results for those of you who are listening. So we see that 82% of our audience today responded that ventilators were used in their facility to help with COVID patient breathing. 15% though saw that CPAP and BiPAP device was used. And Jerry, would you like to comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, actually, while CPAP and BiPAP are not technically ventilators, they do assist breathing. Typically, you'll find these for sleep apnea patients and the like. But in this case, we were we all had to use whatever we had available in the hospital and then find ways to get more because there was such an influx of patients who needed the assistance. So ventilators certainly control breathing. They can assist breathing as well. CPAP and BiPAP assist breathing and in many different ways and are also effective. We're curious about the anesthesia machines, especially in the broad United States and Western European markets or areas of the world where they may have needed to employ anesthesia systems and anesthesia ventilators to supplement and augment the inventory of available devices for use. So what did we see on anesthesia systems, Katya?
We saw 3% of people respond that anesthesia machines were used.
Interesting. So they did get
Yeah.
employed. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Really great. This is great for us to know because it colors how we talk about testing these kinds of devices using the test instruments that we make for you.
It also shows the creativity of hospitals, right, to
Yes,
meet that
yes,
need.
indeed. And we should talk about that too, because in many parts of the world, they didn't have the access to manufacturers who could quickly ramp up production on key things. And we did have, in many parts of the world, we had companies who had never made ventilators or anything before decide now it's time to invent something. And so they were creating something from scratch that was basically um, a mechanical squeezing of a breathing bag to help the patient, help to assist the patient breathing, just that simplistic, all the way to some pretty sophisticated technologies. So it's really, really, really interesting.
And Jared, that made for some interesting challenges when we're working with our customers. Some of the product support questions we were asked weren't the typical questions anymore. It wasn't only by biomeds who were going to use our devices to test medical devices. A lot of these were startups. Some of our customers were these startups that you're mentioning who may have had little or no experience building ventilators and all of a sudden had a whole series of questions. It was pretty interesting there for a few weeks when everything really started kicking off.
Indeed.
Yeah, I think it forced all of us to be a little bit more creative, right?
Oh, and learn more.
Yes.
And do it all by the internet. Like you couldn't go
Yeah,
face to face anymore and go out and meet the customer. So it was Zoom calls at all hours of the night and phone calls on the weekends and people working a primary job and at nighttime volunteering or doing other jobs just to help out their community.
indeed.
All right, so I'll jump over to the last medical device here, which is the infusion pump. And these are devices that are used to ensure that a patient is getting a precise dose of either some sort of nutrient they like or a treatment over a certain period of time. So these devices, they need to be accurate and functioning free of errors, since a few things can happen. Similar to patient monitors, these devices alarm. So if the alarm doesn't sound properly, a patient might miss their intended treatment for a period of time, right? If that doesn't sound at all, or have a drug under-delivered and suffer a negative outcome, right? And that negative outcome could be, increased pain, awareness, injury, whatever it is that's being infused can have an effect on that. So both of those cases are from under administration. There's also the inverse, which is over administration. And too much flow can be harmful to a patient just as too little flow can be. So over infusion can lead to overdose, right? And even patient death. So you definitely don't want to be on that extreme. So making sure that the flow is accurate is definitely key to making sure your infusion pumps are operating properly. One other thing to note is air in the system, right? Air can enter the cardiovascular system through the infusion pump, and in severe cases, that air bubble can lead to cardiac arrest when it goes through that patient's cardiovascular system. So a lot of different types of errors here, but again, it's critical to make sure that your infusion pump is working properly, functioning accurately, right? But also that those alarms work because they are critical.
All right, so here are some groupings of electrical safety or of test instrument by category. So we talked about the need for electrical safety testing, and that includes the leakage current testing on patient connections that are continuously conductive. Patient simulator is how we send a known signal or set of signals into the front end of the patient monitor and observe both on the monitor screen and on the strip chart recorder that the information that we sent is the information that is displayed one way or another. The gas flow analyzer and a certified test lung for testing ventilators, BiPAP, CPAP, and the anesthesia ventilator, and then indeed the anesthesia system itself, even before the ventilator, for concentration of anesthetic delivery. Infusion pumps, analyzers in order to do that assessment that Mike was just talking about. So these are all groupings that we certainly provide to you and provide training about, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But
Oh, hey,
there was
Jerry.
also, go ahead, I was just going to segue over to you, Justin, about
Oh,
some problems that trying to carry all of this gear into a patient room that needed to be where the patient needed isolation from other
yeah,
people. So, because we're trying to flatten the curve, right?
right. And it just made me think, we talked about using our gas flow analyzers for ventilators, but don't forget, a lot of the monitors have Untitled CO2, and you have to measure the airflow through those pumps as well. So there is some crossing where you might be using some of these devices some people might not have thought about right off the bat. But you're right, with these isolated patient care areas and having to work with negative pressure controlled areas and positive pressure controlled areas, I got to see some pretty innovative things that people did in the field, including a hospital that took an old sleep lab, and in a matter of weeks, they converted their sleep lab to a COVID floor. And in order to help isolate the patients, they're able to take some of these medical devices we talked about and place them in a hallway and pass the lines and tubes through airlocks essentially into the patient care area. That way the staff could access the medical devices without having to change out the PPE so much, because PPE was becoming a real shortage up here where we live. And
Yeah, go ahead.
And carrying these devices in, all of a sudden presented a problem. Some of the questions that we get asked by our customers is, hey, I have to take this into this care area. How are we going to disinfect it now? And it made people really think about how many devices they had to carry through into the isolated portion of the hospital. Some places weren't allowed to bring the medical devices back out, so the service had to be done in that area. Some other places had it where they said, you know what, I hear you, but we're going to have to take and swap this medical device out, sanitize it, disinfect it, bring it down to biomed to service, and then take back. So all these changing rules made for quite a dilemma. But for the people who had to take the medical devices, take the test equipment into the medical device, how many of these analyzers did you have to carry at once? And looking at things like this, maybe a consideration is how many things can your analyzer do? So all of a sudden, some of these features that we tend to overlook, maybe, like the patient simulator built into the electrical safety analyzer. Was that enough to simulate your ECG waveforms that you need to do your PM with? So the multifunction aspect of a lot of these devices all of a sudden became a big concern.
Yeah, and note
Justin,
that,
I will.
go ahead, Katya,
Oh,
go ahead.
I just wanted to quickly interrupt the discussion with one of the questions that we actually received in the question section, well, where we encourage everyone to submit their questions. But the question is, what is a patient simulator? And this question may have come from an aspiring biomed. So Justin, do we want to cover that for a few
Oh,
minutes?
sure.
So yeah,
That's a great question. So everything you see on the screen here, we have essentially two categories. One is analyzers and one is simulators. So with an analyzer, we'll start with that one first. With an analyzer, we're going to look at the energy produced by another device. So we're going to analyze that energy. But with a patient simulator, it's going to be the device that's going to create the energy. So we're going to simulate all the different parameters of a patient, the heartbeat, their ECG waveform, the non-invasive blood pressure, and we can simulate multiples of these either together or individually. So for instance, like that ProSim8 can do 8 parameters at one time. How to do
and
with that one?
right. And by the way, what you see on the display on the slide right now is not an exhaustive list of the variety of different products that we have in each of the categories for test instruments. And there may be some situations where you just need to go into the patient care area and determine is the medical device really something wrong with it, or really not something wrong with it and it was something else, which maybe didn't need the entire array that you see here, but a more simplified array. So there's a big variety. We're showing these in this way just to be, kind of specific around the categories, but there's more depending on what really needs to be done. So speaking of which, the COVID definitely increased the need for testing efficiency to be able to get testing done, enough testing done to be able to show that the medical device is working right or not working right. So one of the things that can really help that is in our offering of test instrument, and some others, there is something that we categorize as onboard automation. That is some form of automation that automating the testing that can be done by that particular test instrument for that particular category of medical devices. So in this case, we're showing an infusion device analyzer, and it has onboard automation to automate a short flow and sequence of tests, auto sequences of tests that need to be run on a particular brand and model of infusion device. So that's one way that you can efficiently get work done and standardize it in a way so that everybody does the testing about at least that category of medical device, does it in the same way with repeatable and statistically significant test results so that they can be evaluated for failure rate later. So, and pulling those test results directly off the test equipment, in this case, onboard automation provides a way to do that with just using more simplistic ways of extracting the test results, but organizing them into a so that all of the tests that are relevant to a particular inventory number on the medical device are all grouped together, so you get them all out when you extract them. This really saved time in terms of how quickly you can get testing done within limits, of course, because there are certain things and certain tests that need to be run, and it takes a little bit of time. We're not violating the laws of physics here in any way, but we are running a more efficient way of doing the testing. So we have another question now, and this one, Katya, you want to introduce this question?
Absolutely. So during COVID, we got an increased number of questions from, our customers and, just biomeds in the world about the increased needs for, the disinfection and the challenges that all of that creates with the way they document their test results. And with that, we were curious, about your experience with the kind of like the tracking the work orders and then documenting the results that you get from the test procedures that you perform. And the question here is, how do you interact with your CMMS, if you have one, while doing medical device testing? And of course, there's no right or wrong answer. We just want to understand the situation that you are in, and the options that we thought may be the most popular are A, we do not have a CMMS, we use paper to document results. B, we do have a CMMS, and after we're done with testing, we enter the results later. And C, we do have a CMMS, which we interact with via a laptop or a tablet or a smartphone, right at the end of a preventive maintenance procedure. So,
and just for everybody's, sorry to interrupt, Katya, just for everybody's information, jargon is terrible. CMMS means Computerized Maintenance Management System. It is the database that you use to keep track of all the medical devices in your hospital inventory and generate your work assignments and close out your work assignments at minimum. But they can do more, but they do at least that much.
Thank you, Jerry. Yes, that's a good clarification. So I think we're ready for a new poll. let's hear from the audience. Again, we're going to give it a few moments to collect responses, and then Dan will announce the results. All right. So Dan, are you ready to share the responses with us? There we go. All right. So we're seeing that 21% of our attendees who answered the poll do not have a CMMS and have to use paper to document their test results. 30,
Wow.
yeah.
Wow. That's terrible. We'll talk about
Um,
why in a minute. Go ahead.
30%, so a third of the respondents does have a CMMS and does enter the results later. And then 47%, wow, a half of the respondents not only do have a CMMS, but also interact with it in real time via laptop or some other mean of technology, which is really interesting to hear.
Indeed. Indeed it is. And that's because of the increase in need for testing efficiency and something that we're categorizing or calling workflow automation. So in onboard automation, we could we could run an auto sequence of tests, but about only what that test instrument can do. And then the problem with that was that even downloading that information, you still have more than one report of measurements, test instrument by test instruments, category by category, and you have to have some way to make sure that those are able to get reported properly into your CMMS or database. So, and oh, by the way, the entire step-by-step process that you're carrying out, visual, physical inspections, things that need to be replaced if the medical device includes a filter or something that either needs to be cleaned or just replaced. Things like that are not included in doing the testing or documenting the testing just with onboard automation or just with manual operation of your test gear. So workflow automation seeks to encompass all of that. Everything that you're going to do, every test you're going to run, whether the test instrument that you're going to use has the ability to communicate with your testing software or your CMMS or not. So if you needed to use a gapping tool or a ruler or a stopwatch, those don't have ports to be able to automatically communicate their measurements to your workflow. And so those need to be accommodated too. So whether you can have interoperability with your test instrument on the front end or not, we need to get those measurements and pass or fail into the database. And then on the back end, we need to be able to close out or have the database automatically close out anything that passed. Because if it passed, we're good. But if it failed, then we also need the failure information in order to populate in the database a series of entries that allow us to trend over time and get more of the failures and get a failure rate. So workflow automation is what helps us do that. And some of you, those of you that have a CMMS that you interact with in real time or interact with, and then if you're not online during that real time work, will automatically synchronize and upload your results to your work assignment to help you close it. Those are all ways that we can reduce the sources of human error, drive standard workflows so that everybody does the testing in the exact same flow and sequence of tests, step by step, so that the information going into the database is indeed statistically significant and appropriate for generalization of what we're seeing across a whole series of brands and specific models of medical device, or a category by category set of medical devices. So these are all really important. They may not be important to you as a worker, but they're definitely important to your manager and to the reason why we have biomed as a functional area and a career field in the first place. So workflow automation is really what gives us all of that, and the best of the best interoperate end to end, from the test equipment all the way through to the database and your work assignment closure. So those things were important, and those who had these kinds of systems working that they could use were those that have been better able to respond in this pandemic. And from what we're hearing, just as of this morning, more of you are feeling that workload increase back up because some of the testing that you needed to do was postponed in order to focus on the critical few. And that's fine, but now all of that work is still got to be done, and now you've got your plate overflowing with work assignments. This is how these things can help you respond appropriately and get through that big tsunami of work that's facing you. Looks like Mount Everest, and really you could really get through it in a better way.
You know, I'll chime in on this one too. You know, being a biomed for years and in the field, some things that frustrated me because, you know, as a biomed, there's two things I really wanted to do. One was drink coffee, and the other one was tear something apart to fix it. And PMs prohibited both of those for some odd reason. You weren't allowed to bring coffee into the OR, I guess. But long story short, you know, this workflow automation actually does add a whole other series of niceties and considerations that we might not have thought about prior to COVID. You know, one of them is infection control. COVID was a respiratory droplet-based disease or virus, you know, so we're carrying around paper, we're carrying around manuals. You know, I used to work on sterilizers, and my sterilizer manual, half the pages were torn out of it or covered in grease from working on it and trying to read my pieces of paper. But all that grease just represented something that I never thought about before. It's like, as I'm walking into these patient care areas and I'm setting down my notebooks or my manuals, I set them on the patient surfaces. You know, if we read a lot of these cleaners and stuff, you know, they're only effective to 99 point whatever percent. Was that surface in fact clean? You know, was whatever I'm working on thoroughly disinfected, or because everyone is stressed out and having a bad day and everything's going really crazy and cattywampus, did somebody miss something and I just set my paper into it and absorbed those respiratory droplets with the virus in it? Well, then I'm going to be touching that manual not just today, but tomorrow and next week and the week after that. And even worse, when I'm done, I'd bring that paper back to my desk where, you know, let's face it, a lot of us eat our lunch sitting at our desk so we can surf the internet. And now I have all that stuff that I set my manuals and my notebook in all morning on my desk with the food I'm eating.
Or even worse, moving from room to room, patient
yeah, 100%, Jerry. Or bringing it back to our assistant in the shop and putting it on her desk, Tanner.
Yeah.
You know, and then another thing that really comes out of this workflow automation is that how much of your time is spent remembering how to do that PM, you know, or do that service, or even better yet, you know, now that we had to split our shifts to a day shift and a night shift, and you have your senior level technicians putting this data in, how do you get that knowledge base from your senior techs to your junior techs? And this workflow automation offers a way to do that. It's a vehicle to do so, because you can intersend pictures and JPEGs and PDFs. So all of a sudden, all that knowledge that you've gathered have a place to be stored. So
we call that visually guided workflows.
100%, man. And what it came down to is, instead of spending 2 hours trying to remember how to do the PM, there it is. Here's my picture. Here's the list of the tools I need. Because that's the other thing, you know, ORs or ICUs are nowhere near the biomed shop ever. I mean, that's like a 6-mile walk sometimes or something. At least it feels like that way with your cart. And to get the whole way there and realize that you forgot something, you got to go the whole way back. Was really quarrelsome. And there's another place to put all this data so that you can remember, hey, yo, you know what? Here it is, right here in my work order. Here's a picture of everything I need to go today. Cool. Now I have all that. Here's how to remember how to start to do it. Here's the access code, how to get into it. And here's where it was hidden in the patient room. That's all huge time savers that allow me to go back to my cup of coffee. Just saying.
Yep. Indeed. So just to
And
review here a little bit, go ahead, Katya.
we just got a question that I believe is related to this workflow automation software piece, which is why I want to ask it now instead of waiting until the Q&A. So is there a need to install a program for each simulator when we talk about the software?
Actually, while that was true with our MedTester product before and our Answer software before, with our current workflow automation software, it is not. It's automatically there, and then you can keep up with the further releases and updates of that software as we build out more front-end interoperability. So using the standardized test procedures where you can automatically populate test results that come directly from the interoperability with the test instrument, or at least you can do a quicker entry of those measurements that you see on your display screen if your test instrument is not interoperable with the software. You can provide visual guidance, as Justin was just talking about. So, I mean, how good is that? Even your least experienced person should be able to follow a visually guided workflow. Even people that are affected by dyslexia, where text is not their friend, it's hard to read, can follow a visually guided workflow. And now you've got a much better way to keep everybody on track. Uploading the results automatically to the database, the CMMS at the end. Again, whether you have it uploaded automatically while you're doing your work as soon as you finish the workflow, or whether that sits on your computer or tablet until you get back to the shop and then it synchronizes. Either way, those results are going to be automatically uploaded. And if the interoperability on the back end has been completely designed, it's going to include the ability to automatically close those work assignments where all of the measurements that were made, all of the work that was done in that workflow have passed. In other words, they were within the testing limits.
And
so
you got all the steps done.
Exactly. So that all takes a whole lot of work off of you on the front end and back end, and it removes the need for paper documentation. You can have paper if you want it at the end. You can print out the results from the database at the end. You can append PDFs if you need to of the complete workflow to close the work assignment. But indeed, it drastically reduces the amount of paper documentation that you're going to be doing, which again can be very effective in reducing potential for cross-contamination, whether it's cross-contamination of people within your biomed department or further cross-contamination patient to patient.
Yeah,
Just
it's much
because you
easier
were
to wipe
there.
off a laptop or your tablet or your cell phone than it is to wipe off the pages of a notebook.
You bet. You bet. So increasing the need for efficiency, we provide education and training. And what does this do? All of these are free. They don't cost anything, just a little bit of your time to go and visit the courses that are available in Advantage Training and those Empower webinars and other webinars that are available in the webinars section of our website, as well as videos. We have application videos that show you the use of various of our test instruments that we provide. So all of these are effective to help shorten the learning curve of someone that you've just hired that has lots of experience in electronics or or mechanics, but doesn't have much background in biomed. These things help shorten their learning curve and make them more effective in terms of being on the team with the rest of you in your department. So don't forget about those. And all of these are effective. Advantage Training is sets up academic style courses that have a test that you need to pass. But you know what the great thing about that is? You don't have you can take the test as many times as you need to until you pass, and then you get your certificate of completion. So all of these are designed to help you never fail to be able to do the work that you need to do relative to testing of medical devices and keeping the quality assurance really well assured and making sure that your clinicians are confident in the medical devices that they are given that help them do their job better and more effectively. And actually, all of that saves lives.
Hey, Jerry, that's always a great way. You know, when I'm working with our customers and going out in the field and talking to people, when I show them that section, that knowledge center, there's never not been a, let's try that again in English. There hasn't been a time yet where someone hasn't gone, hey, you know what? I didn't know that we could do this with our analyzer. That's a great place to find out all those tips and tricks and really get the full potential of the investment of your Fluke devices. Not to mention free CEUs. Free CEUs are nice.
Yep. And then what happens is when you do have questions, and you will, when you interact with our tech support team, your questions are better and much more specific, which allows our tech support team to be able to actually answer your question. And there's an escalation process about asking questions. Never, please never be afraid to ask the questions. We will respond and we'll get you an answer. All right, so thank you so much for, go ahead, Katya.
Oh, I just wanted to say the same thing. Thank you all very much for attending the webinar. We're not done yet. We're moving on to the Q&A. However, those of you who may be too busy to stay, we appreciate your attention. We appreciate your time, and we're switching on to the Q&A. We got quite a few questions here in the questions tab and go to webinar. And let me start, and I apologize in advance. I do not see the names of the people who asked those questions, so we're just going to go anonymously. First question we have there is, how are you dealing with access to the ICU rooms? And I think the question is more related to, you know, the biomed work rather than to the Fluke biomedical experts. But Justin, I think you could take that one as you're constantly in the field.
Oh man, I have seen all kinds of models implemented. I saw one of my facilities, they took a closet, for lack of a better term, at the back end of the hallway in the ICU, and they decided they didn't want to risk bringing equipment out of that ICU, out of that COVID ward. So they had the technician go essentially through, like, you could think of like an airlock. They went in, they put on PPE, they decontaminated all their equipment, they went in and did their PMs. Then they had to decontaminate anything that had to come back out. So they actually went into that environment to work. I've seen the models, some other facilities where they said, no, we don't want to take our gear into there and risk its contamination. So anything that had to be serviced had to be decontaminated and brought out. And you know what? Both of these models added so much time because it takes time to don that PPE and to disinfect everything. And that became a real challenge, even getting access to equipment. So coming upstairs or, you know, to that ICU just to determine if the piece that you need to work on today was free. Man, that was a great challenge, you know, for people. So lines of communication had to be established in the hospital about how to get into the gear and what gear could be freed up and what hours could be freed up. I saw some shops that started having a crew that went in at 2 o'clock in the morning because that was the lowest time where they could get to the equipment. And some just had to, unfortunately, delay even servicing it for a few weeks because they just couldn't get off a patient. So there's been all kinds of models. I think the greatest thing that's come out of COVID is, though, that it really put these biomed shops to task, and some great ideas on how to solve these problems have come out. And watching these teams work together and grow has been really amazing.
This is, in my experience, as working across 3 different hospitals, 3 different biomed departments, supervising or managing each one, the communication between each biomed staff member and the clinical staff in each of the units, especially critical care and those areas where we have less access, less frequently, is critical to making all of this work. And what we're, again, just to comment on what Justin was saying about what we're hearing about, is that a lot of you have improved and increased that intercommunication between the clinical staff and yourself. And that builds confidence in you, and efficient and effectively doing the work that needs to be done and identifying what's broken and what's not is also critical. That confidence building is so important. Guess what? Then you get invited to the table when it comes time to make a better choice about a brand or model of medical device that's going to be replacing something else that has been problematic with high failure rates or difficult user interfaces and things like that. All of this works together and begins to make make it more fun to come to work rather than a drudge, because you're facing a workload that you know you can't complete within the work day or the work week or the work month.
Jerry, you just made me think about it, man. You triggered a memory. My boys down the road here in Mount Nittany, they just launched, not only did they launch workflow automation, they launched a brand new CMMS platform in light of everything that's going on. And one of the big selling points in their department is they got the nursing staff on the floor to work with them. So when they have equipment due, they're going off of color-coded stickers. So if the nursing staff sees one of these devices is open in that ward, they simply enter into their CMMS platform and they get on a big monitor to buy them and shop that device is available now. So that's really reduced those guys' time.
See, that intercommunication is so crucial to be able
Key.
to really have things work well.
100% key, man.
I have a couple more questions that I think are related somewhat to the first one that I asked. So one of them is, what do we do with the analyzers after the calibration is done in an isolation ward for added safety?
Well, they need to be cleaned. Disinfected, perhaps, but certainly at least cleaned. Um, and again, we never ever test medical devices while the patient is connected to them, and we should always replace single patient use items, especially or things like ventilator breathing circuits that have been used by the patient. Those will cause problems with the inside of things like ventilator or gas flow analyzers. So you want to be really careful that you're doing the testing appropriately, and that yes, you do testing with those single patient use breathing circuits, but only after that you've satisfied yourself that the medical device is performing according to its manufacturer's specifications and the standards. So they do need to be cleaned, and there are in every user manual for every test instrument that we provide, there is a section about how what our recommendation is for cleaning that test instrument. So if you're going into such an area, you need to follow that between each patient area, really. And it's not that hard. It sounds really hard. It sounds like you got to take it back down to the shop. You got to do a lot of stuff. No. It's not quite that hard. You can do it quickly, but it needs to be done effectively. You have a role to play, COVID or not, in infection control in your hospital. And working very closely with the infection control staff is also critical to high confidence in your biomed department. It shows, number one, you care. Number two, you're interested in and engaging with them so that they can achieve the reduction of cross-contamination and nosocomial infection within the hospital. So the policies of the hospital are important that you follow, and the user manual recommendations about how to clean the device, whether it's the test instrument or the medical device, are also critical. So central processing needs to have been instructed on how to clean the medical devices, but you do too. And then your test instrument is up to you. And we provide you that information in the user manual.
Don't forget your filters on your ventilator analyzers. Please use your pre-filter. If you suspect it's dirty, get a new one.
Yes.
Thank you both, Jerry and Justin, for such an elaborate answer to the previous question, because we got quite a few questions on, you know, the test device disinfection, medical device disinfection. So I'm hoping that it provides a little bit more information to those of you who are asking those. Unfortunately, we do not have time for any more questions. I wanted to send our emails to chat for everyone. I do not know if I were able to do so, but in any case, I apologize. We don't have any more time to answer any more of your questions. Please reach out to us by email. You can find it on our website, flukebiomedical.com, and we will try and answer as many questions as we can. With that, again, thank you very much for attending today's webinar. Thank you very much to our speakers, and we will see you at the next event.
Thank you
Thanks,
everyone for
everybody.
joining.